Hey there, sleepless rabble. Can't sleep? Perfect. Because tonight I'm taking you somewhere cold. Not just winter cold, the kind that seeps into your bones and never lets go. We're heading to Imperial Russia, where silk and scripture were just masks, and behind them lurked something far darker. Her name was Darya Nikolayevna Saltykova. To the world, she was a saintly widow, a woman of prayer dripping with piety and power. But history remembers her as a shadow, a noblewoman whose reputation gleamed like gold, while behind the heavy doors of her estate, fear ruled in silence. They called her Saltychika, officially 38 lives. Rumors? Well, let's just say you'll lose count before we're done. Tonight, we unravel a tale the Empire tried to bury under snow and silence. Power, cruelty, and hypocrisy dressed in velvet. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a reminder that monsters don't always wear chains. Sometimes they wear rosaries. So, grab your blanket, dim the lights, and let me take the weight of the day off your shoulders. If this descent into history's frostbitten underbelly keeps you company, tap that like button, subscribe, and join our ever-growing sleepless circle. And tell me in the comments, do you think Darya was born cruel, or did power carve her into what she became? This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and tonight you're listening to The Countess of Shadows, When Nobility Turned Deadly. Now, let's begin. Her name was Darya Nikolayevna Saltykova. To the outside world, she was the perfect image of noble grace, wealthy, well-connected, deeply religious. She donated to churches, prayed in candlelight, and spoke with the calm authority of someone born to rule. People bowed when she entered a room. People whispered blessings when she passed. But history doesn't remember her as a saint. It remembers her as a shadow, a figure so feared that even her name became a curse. The official records list 38 lives, 38 young women who stepped through her gates and never walked out again. Most were barely out of childhood, sent to her estate to work, to serve, to survive. 38 is the number carved in the court files, but the whispers suggest far more. Some say 60, some say 100. Enough that local families began burying their grief in silence, too terrified to speak her name above a whisper. And why? For reasons that seem almost absurd. A teacup cracked by accident, a wrinkle in a gown, a task done too slowly. The kind of mistakes that in most houses would earn a sigh or a scolding. In hers, they could mean the end of everything. Those who lived under her roof spoke of punishments that didn't just correct, it broke. Days of relentless beatings. Nights left outside in the freezing air. Skin scalded by water drawn straight from the boiling pot. The details were never written in full. They didn't have to be. The bruised silence of the survivors said enough. And yet, no one stopped her. Not the priests who blessed her halls, not the neighbors who hosted her for tea, not even the officials who heard the rumors and quietly looked away. Because in the 18th century Russia, a woman of her rank was untouchable. Her status wrapped her like armor, and her piety made the perfect mask. She could spend a morning in prayer and an evening watching another soul break, and society would applaud her devotion. For years, the snow covered the truth, until the whispers grew too loud, even for Moscow to ignore. Families began to risk everything to seek justice. Letters were sent. Pleas made their way up the chain of command. And finally, someone listened. But that's the end of the story. To understand the beginning, to understand her, we need to peel back the silk curtains and look at the world that shaped her. What forges a woman who smiles at icons by day and unleashes terror by night? Was it rage, madness, or simply the cold privilege of absolute power? To find out, we need to go back to the little girl who would one day become the most feared woman in Imperial Russia. Before she became a shadow whispered about in fear, Darya Nikolayevna Saltykova was just another child of privilege. Born in 1730 into one of Russia's old noble families, her life began under ceilings painted with saints, not clouds. Her earliest memories? Probably not hunger or hardship, but the smell of beeswax on polished floors, the soft rustle of silk skirts, and voices chanting prayers in candlelight. In 18th century Russia, bloodlines were currency, and Darya had plenty. Her family name opened doors that peasants never even saw. She learned to read scripture before she learned to stitch, and her first lessons in morality came not from kindness, but from power. Imagine growing up in a world where your smallest frown could send someone to their knees, where servants moved like shadows, terrified of your displeasure. That was Darya's nursery. They say children mirror what they see. And what Darya saw was a society built on fear, a land where nobles dined on silver while peasants froze outside their gates. Violence wasn't shocking, it was routine. A quick strike, a harsh punishment, an unspoken rule that those at the bottom were less than human. It wasn't called cruelty back then. It was called discipline. Did that shape her? Probably. But there's something more chilling here. Most noble children grew up with the same privilege, and they didn't all turn into monsters. So what made Darya different? Some claim it was a temper, a quick spark that flared into fury at the slightest slight. Others whisper about obsession, a mind that clung to control like a drowning hand clings to wood. Whatever it was, the seeds were there early, watered by a world that applauded obedience and looked away from suffering. By her teenage years, she wasn't just wealthy, she was powerful. And in Russia, power was intoxicating. For a young woman, it was also rare. So when she married Gleb Saltykov, another name dripping with status, the stage was set. A union of wealth, influence, and quiet expectations. From the outside, it looked perfect. Inside, cracks were already forming. Because marriage didn't tame Darya. If anything, it made her sharper. She learned quickly that charm could mask steel, and that behind every polite bow, there was a hierarchy enforced by fear. And soon, she would learn how much she enjoyed standing at the very top of it. But that's a story for later. First, we need to understand what marriage meant for a woman like her in a world like this, and why it gave her the perfect stage for the darkness to come. Marriage in 18th century Russia wasn't about love. It was a transaction, a chess move on a board where family names were everything. And Darya Nikolayevna Saltykova, already a prize piece by birth, became even more valuable when she married Gleb Saltykov. His family was old money, his name carried weight, and with that union, Darya cemented her place among the elite. On paper, it was perfect. Two noble houses merging like rivers into one vast current of wealth and power. In reality, it was as warm as a Siberian winter. Gleb wasn't cruel, but he wasn't gentle either. He was indifferent, a man who preferred his affairs, his estates, his hunting trips, while his young wife learned the silent art of smiling through neglect. And neglect, when left to fester, often breeds something darker. For Darya, marriage was a cage lined with velvet. She had everything: jewels, gowns, banquets, icons glowing in candlelight, and yet nothing that mattered. No passion, no purpose, no voice beyond the hollow rituals of her class. She was ornamental, like the gilded mirrors in her drawing rooms. Polished, admired, but ultimately mute. And here's the thing about cages. Some people rattle the bars. Others start sharpening knives. Darya chose the latter, figuratively at first. When Gleb died unexpectedly, some say from illness, others whisper about fate with a smirk. Darya was just in her mid-20s, a widow, alone, but not powerless. In fact, she was now more dangerous than ever. Because what happens when you take a woman raised on privilege, starved of affection, and hand her absolute control over hundreds of souls? You don't get liberation. You get dominion. As mistress of vast estates, Darya discovered something intoxicating. Command without question. The serfs who worked her land weren't just workers. They were property, bound to her like livestock, without rights or recourse. Their lives were inked under her signature, and in a system built on obedience, fear was the sharpest tool. At first, her punishments were small. Harsh words, long hours, the usual cruelties of noble households. But somewhere along the way, correction turned into obsession. Mistakes, however slight, lit a spark in her that words could no longer extinguish. She needed to show authority, to break defiance before it bloomed. A stain on a dress, days of humiliation, a poorly scrubbed floor, strikes that left scars you couldn't see in candlelight. The punishments grew, both in scale and in creativity, until they became less about discipline and more about something else. Something hungry. Neighbors began to notice a change. They spoke of her temper, her rages, how a calm voice could turn into a storm without warning. Yet, in public, Darya was still the pious widow, draped in black silk, a rosary sliding through her fingers, her lips murmuring prayers while her eyes measured everyone like scales. She funded churches, sent alms, played the role of saint with such conviction that even priests bowed lower in her presence. But behind the heavy doors of her estate, another world thrived. One where loyalty was enforced with blows, where the air grew thick with fear, and where the line between justice and cruelty blurred into something unrecognizable. What drove her? Was it boredom? Rage? A need for control so absolute that it demanded pain as proof? No one could say. Perhaps even she didn't know. But by the time Moscow would hear the whispers, the pattern was set. Lives were ending, quietly, in the shadow of her name. And Darya? She slept soundly beneath icons, her conscience clean as snow. And this was just the beginning. Because soon, her punishments would cross the invisible line between discipline and atrocity. So far across that even a system built to protect the powerful would be forced to look her way. To understand that descent, we need to step inside her home, past the gates, past the halls of polished wood, into the rooms where obedience was bought with suffering. In the glittering theatre of 18th century Russia, reputation was everything. Titles, land, silk gowns, they mattered, yes. But piety? That was the crown jewel. A noblewoman could be cold, cruel, even ruthless, and society would forgive her. As long as she crossed herself at the right moments and kissed the icons with just the right amount of trembling devotion. Darya Nikolayevna understood this better than anyone. If she had a true talent, it wasn't needlework or conversation, it was performance. She wore her faith like armor, gleaming and untouchable. When people spoke her name in public, they lowered their voices out of reverence, not fear. The priests adored her. She was the benefactress who kept the candles burning in their churches, the patroness who slipped heavy coins into their palms during feast days. When she walked into a chapel, heads bowed so low they nearly touched the floorboards. She prayed loudly. She confessed often. She gave generously. In a world obsessed with appearances, she was a masterpiece, and that mask of sanctity would become her greatest weapon. Picture the scene. A drawing room filled with flickering candlelight, icons hanging like silent judges on the walls. Darya kneels on a velvet cushion, rosary beads slipping through her pale fingers. Her lips move in murmured devotion, her eyes glistening in the glow of sacred images. Outside, snow falls like powdered sugar on the rooftops. It's almost holy, this tableau. Almost. Because while her voice hums hymns, the echoes of something far less holy cling to the corners of those walls. The cries of someone punished too harshly for a trivial mistake. The hollow silence that follows. This was the paradox of Darya. Saint in the salons, storm behind the gates. Her estate became a sanctuary of contradictions. Rooms filled with golden icons and holy relics, yet heavy with dread for those who served her. New maids arrived whispering prayers for a better life, unaware that their prayers would soon curdle into pleas for mercy. Servants spoke of her as two people. The lady they saw on feast days, serene and smiling, handing out alms to beggars on the church steps. And the shadow that appeared when the doors closed and candles burned low. That shadow didn't shout. It didn't rage. It spoke softly, almost sweetly, until something snapped and a storm of punishment followed. Those punishments weren't random. They were methodical. A misplaced garment, a tea service handled clumsily. Such things offended her sense of order like cracks in glass. She couldn't look away, couldn't let them slide. So the hammer fell, over and over, while Moscow still believed she was a model of Christian virtue. And that's the beauty of her cover. Every time a whisper dared to rise, it died in the incense smoke of her sanctity. Who would accuse a woman so generous to the church? Who would question the darling of priests and parishioners alike? In Russia, faith was power, and Darya wielded it with more skill than any blade. For years, this dual life thrived. The salons of Moscow saw a grieving widow, draped in black silk, murmuring prayers for her late husband. The villages saw a mistress whose wrath struck like lightning, and through it all, her mask never slipped. If anything, her devotion grew louder as her deeds grew darker, like bells ringing over a graveyard. But masks have limits. Sooner or later, someone peers behind them. And when that happened, the world would discover that beneath the velvet and the prayers, something monstrous was grinning back. Next, we step beyond the facade and into the rooms no outsider ever entered. The place where obedience was carved out with fear and where survival was a game with impossible odds. Step through the gates of Darya's estate and leave your hope outside. The building itself was grand in the way only old Russian estates could be. High ceilings, dark wood polished to a mirror sheen, and the faint perfume of incense clinging to every surface. Icons stared down from the walls like silent wardens, their golden halos gleaming in candlelight. To a stranger, it looked serene, holy even. But for those who served inside, the beauty was a mask stretched thin over something cold and merciless. The household ran like a clock, each cog terrified of slipping out of place. Servants rose before dawn to stoke fires that would never warm them, their breath fogging in the icy corridors as they scrubbed floors until the boards shone like glass. The rhythm of life here wasn't measured by bells or the rising sun. It was measured by her moods. Every glance, every tightening of her lips, Every pause in her voice sent ripples of dread through the staff. And that voice, soft, measured, almost sweet, was the soundtrack of their fear. Darya didn't need to shout. She didn't need to strike in public. Her displeasure was a sentence written in silence, and everyone understood what silence meant. The punishments didn't always leave marks you could see. Sometimes they were days without food, nights spent standing in icy corridors, stripped of furs and dignity. Sometimes it was humiliation served in whispers, words that sliced deeper than any blade. Other times, well, the servants learned not to speak of those, not if they wanted to keep breathing. Whispers floated through the halls like ghosts. A girl who had scrubbed a floor unevenly was suddenly gone. Another, who had spilled water on a gown, vanished after being summoned to the mistress's private rooms. People didn't ask questions. Questions were dangerous. Better to bow lower, move faster, pray harder, and never, ever make a mistake. Fear became a language. New maids learned it in hours, not days. You could see it in their eyes, the wide, darting glances, the shallow breaths when Darya entered the room. They clutched their rosaries tighter, murmured prayers under their breath as if the saints would dare to intervene here. But the saints stayed silent. It wasn't just the cruelty, it was the calculation. Darya's punishments weren't wild bursts of anger. They were deliberate, almost ritualistic. She knew exactly how to break a person without breaking the illusion of her saintly image. Her hands stayed clean in public. Her reputation remained spotless. And every Sunday, she stood in church, candle in hand, haloed by devotion, while back at the estate, her servants hid their tears in corners no one cared to look at. And so the house lived under a kind of frozen terror. Each day began with prayers for mercy and ended with gratitude for simply surviving. But survival wasn't guaranteed. Not when mistakes could be as small as a thread left loose or a glance held too long. This is where her darkness truly took root. In these halls, among these trembling souls, in the quiet corridors where footsteps sounded like warnings. And it's here that the pattern began to take shape. A pattern that Moscow would one day pretend to be shocked by, even though anyone who lived within these walls could have told the story in their sleep. But the whispers couldn't stay confined forever. Secrets have a way of slipping through keyholes, riding on the wind, carrying their tails to ears bold enough to listen. And soon, the fear that had ruled this house would spill beyond its gates, into villages, into parishes, and eventually into the very heart of power. Before that, though, the cruelty would escalate. Quiet punishments would turn into lessons carved deep into memory. And those who remained would learn that obedience had a price far higher than they had ever imagined. Snow has a way of swallowing secrets. In Russia, winter doesn't just blanket the earth, it buries it. And for years, the silence around Darya Saltykova's estate was as deep and cold as the drift piling against its walls. Servants disappeared like frost melting at sunrise, and no one asked why. Questions were dangerous, and in the villages beyond her gates, people understood one thing better than scripture. Survival meant silence. But silence has cracks. It starts with a whisper. A mother asking another why her daughter hasn't returned from service. A father swearing he'll go to the estate himself. Then falling mute when his neighbors remind him what happens to those who make noise. Whispers travel faster than horses. They slip through shutters, curl around hearths, and soon the villagers began humming with unease. "Don't send your girl there," some murmured. "The lady is strange." No one dared speak louder than a breath. They told stories in riddles, never naming her, as if her name itself could summon something dreadful. Some said she was cursed, others claimed she was touched by divine wrath. But all agreed on one thing. Those walls hid something no one wanted to see. And yet, the stream of young women kept flowing toward the estate. Poverty is a cruel matchmaker. A family with empty cupboards will trade fear for bread, hope for a handful of coins. And Darya? She knew that desperation was the strongest chain of all. For the servants trapped inside, life became a theater of quiet terror. They learned the rules fast. Don't spill, don't stain, don't breathe too loudly. And pray. Always pray. Some clung to their rosaries until their knuckles turned white, whispering words that felt hollow in rooms heavy with incense and dread. But prayers didn't stop the vanishings. Girls left one day to run errands and never came back. Others were sent to help in the garden and vanished into snowstorms no one saw. The whispers turned darker. Stories bled from the estate like ink through linen. Punishments that lingered for days. Wounds that never healed. No one could prove them. Because those who could speak were gone. And the few who escaped, they didn't talk. Fear clung to them like frost, sealing their lips even when they were miles away. Still, patterns have a way of drawing eyes. When too many daughters vanish from too few homes, even fear begins to fracture. Some fathers started asking questions in secret. Letters were written, not to neighbors, but to men of rank, clerks, officials, anyone who might listen. The kind of letters that carried not just ink, but desperation. Letters that began with the same chilling line. Another has disappeared. It would take years for those whispers to reach Moscow in a way that couldn't be ignored. Years in which Darya perfected her facade of piety, polishing her reputation as carefully as the silver on her tables. Every feast day, she knelt in church, her head bowed so low you'd think humility lived in her bones. People called her holy, they called her generous, and maybe in a twisted way she was generous in punishment, holy in her belief that she could do no wrong. But outside those chapel doors, winter was listening. And the snow that once swallowed secrets began to echo them instead. Quietly, relentlessly, until even the corridors of power could no longer pretend deafness. The reckoning was coming. Not yet, not soon, but the first letters were already on their way, tucked under seals, carried by trembling hands to men who thought they had seen every sin Russia could offer. They hadn't seen this. Next, we watch fear evolve into fury, and how the impossible happened. Peasants challenging the untouchable. For years, fear was a chain no one dared to break. Families whispered in kitchens, prayed in frozen chapels, and sent their daughters to Darya's estate with a trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd return unscathed. But hope is fragile, and when enough coffins are empty because there were never bodies to fill them, even fear begins to lose its grip. It started small. A father who had buried 2 sons to illness refused to bury the memory of his missing daughter. A mother, hollow-eyed from waiting, slipped out before dawn to ask questions in the next village. Most answers were shrugs, eyes turned to the ground, but the whispers she heard were enough. You're not the only one. Soon the fragments formed a pattern. Different names, different families, all telling the same story. Girls vanishing after entering service at the Saltykova estate. Rumors that sounded like nightmares, stitched together with threads of truth no one wanted to pull. And yet, someone had to. The first letters were timid things, written in cramped, nervous script. They didn't accuse. They pleaded. Your Grace, we beg for your mercy. Something is wrong at the estate of Darya Nikolayevna. The words danced around the truth like frightened mice, careful not to bite. They were sent to local clerks, minor officials, men who preferred their tea undisturbed by trouble. Most letters disappeared into drawers or into fires that crackled a little too cheerfully. But grief has a ways of sharpening resolve. For every unanswered plea, another letter came. Bolder this time. Names were listed. Dates. Stories no one wanted to read. One man even walked to Moscow on foot, frost cracking his boots, to place a petition in the hands of someone who mattered. That someone shrugged, filed it away, and returned to dinner. The machine of power was slow, rusted by privilege. After all, who would dare accuse a noblewoman as wealthy, as devout, as impeccably connected as Darya Saltykova? These were peasants, mere shadows in the empire's vast landscape. Their words weighed less than dust. But dust, in time, can choke. By the late 1750s, the trickle became a flood. Dozens of complaints, signed with names that trembled on the page, began stacking like snowdrift on official desks. And here's the part history likes to skip. These petitions didn't move hearts. They threatened reputations. Because whispers had begun to seep upward, into parlours where men in velvet coats drank brandy and gossiped about scandals like sport. And nothing terrified the aristocracy more than scandal. Behind her estate's gilded doors, Darya must have sensed the shift. Servants later spoke of her temper growing sharper, punishments harsher, as if rage could plug the cracks in her fortress. But fear wasn't enough anymore. Families were risking everything, land, safety, even their lives, to speak against her. Because what's left to fear when you've already lost your child? Eventually the petitions reached someone who couldn't ignore them without consequence. The Empress herself. Catherine II, a woman who understood power like a language and despised anything that made her empire look weak. A noblewoman turning her household into a private chamber of horrors. That wasn't just sin. It was bad publicity. And so the stage shifted. The whispers that once curled around village hearths now echoed in marble halls. Men in uniforms began to take notes. Clerks sharpened their quills. And the name Saltykova, once spoken with reverence, began to curdle into something else. What happens next isn't justice as you know it. This was Imperial Russia after all. Justice moved like molasses in January. But the wheel had started to turn, and for Darya, that meant one thing. Her mask was about to crack. Next, we leave the snow-dusted villages behind and enter the corridors of power, where Catherine the Great herself decides the fate of the woman Moscow once called holy. By the time Catherine II heard the name Saltykova, the whispers had grown teeth. What began as peasant rumours had crept into salons, slithered across polished floors, and landed on the marble steps of power. At first, the Empress brushed it off. What sovereign wouldn't? A noblewoman accused of cruelty by serfs? That was like a dog complaining about the rain. But these whispers didn't die. They multiplied. And when murmurs turn into murmurs heard by foreign ears, an empress starts listening. Catherine understood one truth better than scripture. Power isn't only about strength, it's about image. And the image of her empire mattered. Russia was climbing out of the mud of feudal backwardness, desperate to look civilized in the eyes of Europe. Catherine wasn't about to let her reputation as an enlightened ruler be tarnished by the story of a noblewoman running a private house of horrors. So, she acted. Quietly at first. A letter to a trusted official, inquiries framed as casual, The imperial version of just checking in. When the reports came back, they weren't the vague, deniable rumours she'd hoped for. They were thick with names, dates, and stories that chilled even seasoned bureaucrats. Dozens of servants gone, families ruined, entire villages murmuring the same dark refrain. Saltykova. That was the moment Catherine's curiosity hardened into command. But this wasn't going to be a public spectacle, not yet. Russia wasn't Paris. The court didn't relish blood on the marble. So Catherine played the long game. She summoned investigators, men chosen for loyalty as much as discretion. Their orders were clear: gather proof, peel back the velvet, and do it without shaking the pillars of society. Easier said than done. Because Darya wasn't some minor landowner in a dusty province, she was a Saltykova, a name sewn deep into the tapestry of the nobility. Her friends dined in the same halls as senators and generals. To accuse her openly was to tug a thread that might unravel the whole fabric. And yet, Catherine wanted answers. Answers she could brand as justice, without letting justice look like rebellion. The investigators rode out in silence, their coats heavy with frost and authority. They arrived at the estate like ghosts, all politeness and paperwork. Servants who had learned to fear shadows now found themselves questioned under candlelight, their trembling voices spilling secrets they'd buried under years of silence. What emerged was a pattern too clear to deny. Cruelty not as a lapse, but as a lifestyle. Still, the empire moved slowly, like a frozen river cracking under spring thaw. Weeks turned to months as statements piled up, each sheet of parchment heavy with suffering. And all the while, Darya lived as if nothing had changed. Kneeling in chapels, reciting prayers, her face the very picture of virtue. She even sent donations to monasteries during the inquiry, as if piety could outvote evidence. But Catherine wasn't fooled. She'd worn masks of her own. She recognized the craft. And in her private chambers, lit by the amber glow of imperial chandeliers, she made a decision. Darya Saltykova would face judgment. Not because Catherine believed in fairness, not exactly, but because letting this scandal rot in silence would cost her something more precious than gold. Control. And so, the wheel turned. The summons was signed with an imperial flourish. The hunters had their prey. But this was Russia. Justice didn't gallop. It crawled. And before the reckoning, there would be theatre. Interrogations, debates, whispers behind brocade curtains. The empire would dress its shame in ceremony, because even when punishing a monster, appearances had to be preserved. Next, we enter the cold grandeur of the tribunal, the place where silk gloves hide iron fists, and where the question isn't whether Darya is guilty, but how to punish her without shaking the throne. If you were expecting drama, you'd be half right. But this wasn't a courtroom filled with gasps and finger-pointing. This was Imperial Russia. Justice here wore silk gloves and spoke in whispers. There were no crowds baying for vengeance, no journalists scribbling headlines. The trial of Darya Nikolayevna Saltykova was not for the people. It was for the throne. The summons arrived on parchment thick enough to make a servant's knees shake. Darya was ordered to Moscow, not invited, ordered. For a woman accustomed to power, that single word carried more weight than a dozen accusations. She arrived not in chains, but in a carriage lined with velvet, guarded by soldiers who bowed with stiff politeness. The empire didn't humiliate its own, at least not in public. The tribunal chamber was a hall of contradictions. Icons gleaming in the candlelight, their serene faces watching over men who measured justice in teaspoons. Senators, judges, Officials with powdered wigs sat in a semicircle, quills poised like daggers. And there she was, Darya, dressed in mourning black, a picture of humility. Her rosary glinted softly in her pale fingers, as if she believed the beads could strangle the truth before it left her lips. The charges were read aloud in voices as cold as the marble floors, dozens of complaints from peasants, testimonies of servants, a tally of vanishings too large to dismiss. Each name was a crack in her mask, each date a hammer blow. And yet, Darya didn't flinch. She stared straight ahead, her expression carved from ice. If she felt fear, it didn't show. Perhaps she believed even now that her status would shield her, that the Empire would scold her in private, send her home, and close the book. But Catherine had already written the ending. The interrogations were less about truth than about optics. The tribunal wanted details, enough to satisfy the Empress, but not enough to scandalize the court. After all, how do you prosecute someone without admitting that your entire system let her thrive for years? So they danced. Questions were asked with velvet phrasing. Answers dripped with denial or piety. Witnesses spoke of cruelty cloaked in prayer. Punishments disguised as discipline. And every time the truth threatened to bare its teeth, someone covered it with a silk handkerchief. Still, the evidence was too thick to smother. The testimonies stacked like snowdrifts. Stories of fear so deep, it froze the soul. Of vanishings explained away with lies so brittle, they cracked under pressure. The tribunal scribes wrote in careful strokes, each word a seed that would grow into a verdict already decided before the ink dried. And here's the twist. The Empire didn't want her blood. Not because it pitied her, pity had no seat at this table, but because blood was messy. Blood screamed to the world that something had gone wrong. And Catherine? She wanted control, not chaos. So the death sentence, the one peasants dreamed of, never came. Instead, the tribunal chose a punishment both cruel and calculated. To strip Darya of her rank, her name, her world, and then lock her away where no one would ever hear her voice again. A convent, not as a nun kneeling in peace, but as a shadow behind iron bars. A creature to be hidden, not slain. They called it mercy, but in truth, it was theatre. The final act in a play designed to make the Empress look just and the nobility look untarnished. When the verdict was read, the hall didn't erupt. There was no applause, no gasp, just the scratch of a quill, the murmur of prayers, and the rustle of silk as men who thought themselves righteous closed the ledger on a story that would haunt Russia for centuries. Next, we follow Darya into her final prison, a place colder than the steppe and lonelier than any grave. The verdict didn't spill blood, it spilled silence. No gallows, no headsman's axe, just a slow erasure of everything Darya Saltykova once was. Her estates were seized, her title stripped away like guilt from rotting wood. The woman who had dined under chandeliers now faced the rest of her life, staring at walls the color of dust. They called it mercy. It wasn't. Her new home was the Ivanovsky convent, a place where the scent of incense mixed with damp stone and the chill of forgotten prayers. From the outside, it looked like any other holy sanctuary. Onion domes glinting in pale light, bells tolling softly over the city. But deep within its belly lay a cell not meant for redemption, only containment. 4 paces by 6, a barred window that let in just enough light to remind you what freedom looked like. This was Darya's stage now. No silk, no velvet. Just rough wool and a wooden bench. Her jewelry was gone, her gowns replaced with coarse robes that scratched against her skin like pennants. The rosary beads she once flaunted were replaced with plain wood, their smoothness worn by hands that clutched them in despair rather than devotion. And the sound. That's what broke most people. Not the cold, not the hunger, the silence. Days that bled into nights with nothing but the distant toll of bells to mark the passage of time. No voices save for the low drone of chants seeping through thick walls like smoke. For a woman who once commanded hundreds with a glance, obscurity was a deeper punishment than death. Visitors were rare, almost mythical. Once in a while, a nun would slip braid through the iron grate, eyes averted, lips tight. They didn't speak her name. In the outside world, it was already fading, becoming legend. A cautionary tale murmured in village kitchens and echoed in hushed tones among the nobility. The lady who fell from grace. Did she repent? No one knows. Some said she spent her days in prayer, whispering words that froze before they reached heaven. Others claimed she muttered to herself, pacing the tiny cell like a caged wolf, her mind chewing on memories darker than the stone around her. There's even a story, half myth, half gossip, that when curious pilgrims asked the nuns about the infamous prisoner, they were led to a door with a tiny iron grill, and through it, two eyes stared back, dull as ash, yet burning with something that looked nothing like remorse. She lived like this for decades. Decades. Long enough for empires to shift, for children to grow into adults who only knew her name as a ghost in their grandmother's stories. Time stripped her of everything except breath, and even that clung stubbornly, as if refusing to give her the exit everyone else thought she deserved. When death finally came, it wasn't dramatic. No thunderclap, no whispered absolution. Just another quiet day in a convent that had already forgotten her. She was buried without pomp, without monuments, without a single tear to sanctify the soil. The earth closed over her like a lid on a jar, sealing away a life that had begun in privilege and ended in shadow. But legends don't stay buried. Darya Nikolayevna Saltykova's story still coils through Russian history, like smoke from a fire long extinguished. And in that smoke lingers a question. How does someone who kissed icons and whispered prayers become a name carved into the darkest pages of an empire? To answer that, or to admit it can't be answered, we have to leave her cell behind and step into what remains of her legacy. The myths, the moral lessons, and the uneasy laughter history uses to hide its own guilt. History loves a villain it can point at and say, there, that's the darkness, all in one person. It makes everything easier, doesn't it? A monster behind bars, a name scratched into court ledgers, a story wrapped up like a morality play. But the truth rarely fits in neat packages, and neither does Darya Nikolayevna Saltykova. After her death, the empire exhaled, as if burying her meant burying its own sins. Official records called her reformed, though nothing in her life suggested a redemption. Church sermons whispered about divine justice, as if God had signed off on a punishment designed not for morality but for optics. And the nobility. They wiped their hands with perfumed linen and carried on as before, their drawing rooms fragrant with tea and hypocrisy. The peasants remembered longer. In villages dusted with snow, her name became a warning told by firelight. Don't anger the powerful. Don't trust their prayers. Mothers used her like a bedtime threat. Misbehave, and Saltykova will come for you. Over time, the edges of the truth blurred. She became half woman, half myth, a figure to frighten children and fascinate scholars. And in that blur lies the real horror. When cruelty becomes legend, We stop asking why it happened in the first place. Why did it happen? Was Darya a product of a brutal system, or the system's perfect parasite? Strip away the silk and scripture, and you find something unnervingly familiar. The hunger for control, the thrill of unchecked power, the cold arithmetic of domination. Call it feudalism, call it tyranny, call it human nature in its ugliest frame. Whatever you name it, it didn't die with her. That's the part no one likes to admit. We comfort ourselves by locking monsters in cells, or in history books, and pretending the darkness is gone. But power still corrupts. Masks still work better than swords. And cruelty, it just learned how to smile for the camera. So yes, Darya Saltykova's bones rest in the soil of an old convent. Her breath is long gone, but her story lingers, coiled like smoke in the rafters of memory, whispering the same question every time we glance at gilded halls or scroll through headlines. How many saints wear halos only because no one's looking behind the icons? And maybe, just maybe, the scariest part isn't what she did. It's how long the world let her do it. And that's where her story fades into silence. Decades locked behind iron bars, her voice reduced to a whisper no one cared to hear. Time buried her name, but not the questions it left behind. Was she a product of her world? Or proof that some darkness grows even in candlelight? If you stayed with me through this cold descent, thank you for keeping me company in the quiet hours. If you enjoyed this story, tap that like button, subscribe, and join the Sleepless Circle. We've got plenty more shadows to explore together. And tell me in the comments, which detail struck you most? The power she held? Or how long the world looked away? This was Napmax Sleep Stories, slow steps through the darkest corners of history, told softly for those who can't close their eyes. Sleep well, if you can.